The salt spray stung General Douglas MacArthur's weathered face as he stood on the bridge of the USS Mount McKinley, gazing through his binoculars at the treacherous waters of Inchon Harbor. The morning of September 15, 1950, had arrived with an ominous gray dawn that seemed to mock the audacity of what lay ahead. Behind him, the largest amphibious assault force assembled since World War II bobbed restlessly in the yellow sea, waiting for the order that would either vindicate MacArthur's military genius or destroy his legendary reputation forever. The plan had been dismissed as suicidal by nearly every military expert in Washington. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had argued against it with unprecedented fervor. Admiral Forrest Sherman had called it an impossible operation. Even President Harry Truman had expressed grave doubts about the 70-year-old general's ambitious scheme. But MacArthur, with his characteristic blend of brilliance and hubris, had insisted that only the impossible could save the crumbling United Nations forces. Trapped in the desperate Pusan perimeter, for 3 months, the North Korean People's Army had pushed American, South Korean, and United Nations forces into an ever-shrinking pocket around the southeastern port city of Pusan. The Communist forces, led by Kim Il-sung and backed by Soviet equipment and advisors, had swept down the Korean peninsula with devastating effectiveness. Seoul had fallen within days of the initial invasion on June 25th. The mighty Eighth Army, once considered invincible, had been reduced to a ragtag collection of units fighting for survival in the sweltering heat of the Korean summer. MacArthur's solution was characteristically bold and seemingly impossible. Instead of reinforcing the Pusan perimeter with additional troops, he proposed a strike at the heart of the North Korean supply lines. With a massive amphibious assault on Inchon, the port city that served Seoul, the plan, codenamed Operation Kramite, would land a divisions deep behind enemy lines, cut off the North Korean forces besieging Pusan, and recapture the South Korean capital in one decisive stroke. The obstacles were staggering. Inchon possessed one of the world's most treacherous harbors, with tidal ranges exceeding 30 feet. The narrow flying fish channel leading to the port was barely wide enough for a single ship, and was studded with mud flats that could trap vessels at low tide. The city itself was heavily fortified, with concrete seawalls and natural barriers that seemed designed to repel amphibious assaults. Intelligence reports suggested that the North Koreans had anticipated such an attack and had positioned significant forces to defend the strategic port. As referenced in the official U.S. Navy historical records, the preliminary bombardment had begun 2 days earlier, with naval gunfire and air strikes pounding suspected North Korean positions around Inchon. The deception operations had been carefully orchestrated to convince the enemy that the real assault would come elsewhere, perhaps at Kunsan to the south or even at a secondary landing on the east coast. But MacArthur had dismissed these concerns with the confidence that had made him one of America's most celebrated military commanders. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by maps and communications equipment, he radiated the calm assurance of a man who had orchestrated successful amphibious operations. From the Philippines to New Guinea, his staff officers, seasoned veterans of the Pacific Campaign, watched their commander with a mixture of admiration and anxiety as the minutes ticked toward the assault time. The general's piercing eyes swept across the assembled fleet. 300 ships stretched across the horizon, carrying the 1st Marine Division, elements of the 7th Infantry Division, and supporting units from multiple nations. These were the finest troops America could muster, Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, soldiers who had crossed the Rhine and stormed the beaches of Normandy. Yet even these veterans felt the weight of the moment as they prepared to execute what many considered the most audacious military operation since D-Day. The first assault waves hit the beaches of Inchon at exactly 5:30 in the morning. Just as the tide reached its peak, the massive 30-foot tidal surge that had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle now became MacArthur's greatest ally, lifting the landing craft over the seawalls and mud flats that had been expected to stop them cold. The sound of naval gunfire had been thundering across the harbor for hours, pulverizing North Korean defensive positions and creating a wall of steel. that preceded the Marines ashore. Major General Oliver Prince Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had positioned himself aboard the command ship to coordinate the complex landing. His Marines had trained for months in amphibious warfare, but nothing could have prepared them for the eerie silence that greeted their assault. The expected waves of North Korean defenders never materialized. Instead, the Marines found themselves advancing through a landscape of smoking rubble and abandoned positions, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris from the devastating preliminary bombardment. The North Korean garrison at Inchon numbered fewer than 2,000 men, a fraction of the force that MacArthur's intelligence officers had predicted. Most were poorly equipped militia units and administrative personnel, completely unprepared for the shock of a major amphibious assault. The few regular army units in the area had been withdrawn weeks earlier to reinforce the offensive against the Pusan perimeter, leaving Inchon defended by little more than a skeleton crew of coastal artillery and support troops. Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller, the legendary Marine officer whose chest was decorated with 4 Navy crosses, led his regiment inland with characteristic aggression. His men encountered sporadic resistance from North Korean snipers and machine gun nests, but the enemy positions crumbled under the sustained assault of Marines who had perfected their craft in the crucible of Pacific warfare. By noon, the port facilities were in American hands, and the crucial Flying Fish Channel had been cleared of mines and obstacles. The success of the landing exceeded even MacArthur's optimistic projections. Casualties were remarkably light, with fewer than 200 United Nations troops killed or wounded in the initial assault. The North Korean defenders, caught completely off guard by the timing and scale of the operation, either fled inland or surrendered in large numbers. The strategic port that had been expected to exact a terrible price from the attackers had fallen with surprising ease. As the afternoon wore on, the scope of the strategic coup became apparent. Radio intercepts revealed confusion and panic in North Korean command centers. Throughout the peninsula, the enemy high command, which had been focused exclusively on the final offensive against Pusan, suddenly found themselves facing a major threat to their rear areas. Supply lines that had been flowing smoothly from the north were now vulnerable to interdiction, and the prospect of being cut off from their homeland created immediate tactical problems for North Korean field commanders. The capture of Inchon's airfield was particularly significant. Within hours of the landing, Marine aircraft were operating from the facility, providing close air support for the advancing ground forces and establishing air superiority over the western approaches to Seoul. The psychological impact of seeing American warplanes overhead was devastating to North Korean morale, while boosting the confidence of United Nations forces, who had spent months retreating under enemy air attack. MacArthur himself came ashore on the afternoon of September 15th, striding across the beach with the theatrical flair that had made him one of the most recognizable figures in American military history. Wearing his signature sunglasses and corncob pipe, he surveyed the captured port with evident satisfaction. The gamble that had been criticized as reckless had paid off spectacularly, validating his strategic vision and restoring his reputation as a military genius. The general's first order was characteristically ambitious: advance immediately on Seoul. There would be no consolidation of the beachhead, no pause to bring up additional supplies or reinforcements. The momentum gained by the surprise landing had to be exploited ruthlessly before the North Koreans could organize an effective counterattack. The race for the South Korean capital had begun, and MacArthur intended to win it decisively. The evening of September 15th found American forces firmly established ashore, with supply ships already beginning to unload equipment and ammunition at the captured port facilities. The impossible had become reality, and the Korean War had taken a dramatic turn that would reshape the entire conflict. The morning of September 16th dawned clear and cold, revealing the full extent of the United Nations strategic advantage. From his command post overlooking Inchon Harbor, MacArthur could see the steady stream of supply ships bringing ashore the men and equipment needed to sustain the offensive. The massive logistical operation, coordinated by Rear Admiral James Henry Doyle, was proceeding with clockwork precision despite the challenging conditions of the harbor. The advance toward Seoul began immediately, with Marine and Army units pushing inland along multiple axes. The 1st Marine Division, led by General Smith, moved northeast toward Kimpo Airfield, the strategic aviation facility that controlled the approaches to the South Korean capital. Meanwhile, elements of the 7th Infantry Division, under Major General David Greenwood Barr, swung southeast to secure the flanks and prevent North Korean reinforcements from interfering with the main assault. The landscape through which the American forces advanced told the story of 3 months of brutal warfare. Villages that had changed hands multiple times showed the scars of repeated battles, with burned-out buildings and abandoned equipment littering the countryside. The roads were clogged with refugees, South Korean civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of the conflict and were now fleeing toward the perceived safety of the American lines. The North Korean response to the Inchon landing was confused and ineffective. General Kim Chek, commanding the North Korean forces in the south, had been caught completely off guard by the amphibious assault. His forces were scattered across the peninsula, with the bulk of his combat power committed to the offensive against Pusan. The few reserve units available were poorly positioned to respond to the threat in the west, and communications difficulties made it impossible to coordinate an effective counterattack. By September 18th, Marine units had reached the outskirts of Kimpo Airfield, encountering increasingly stiff resistance from North Korean forces who had finally begun to organize a coherent defense. The battle for the airfield became a bitter struggle, with both sides recognizing its crucial importance. The North Koreans had positioned anti-aircraft guns and infantry in prepared positions around the facility, while American forces brought up tanks and artillery to support the assault. The capture of Kimpo on September 19th marked another crucial milestone in the operation. The airfield's runways were soon filled with American aircraft, including the new F-86 Sabre jets that would prove decisive in the air war over Korea. The psychological impact of American air power operating from the doorstep of Seoul was enormous, both for the demoralized North Korean forces and for the South Korean civilians, who had endured months of communist occupation. That as the advance continued, reports began filtering back from the Pusan perimeter of a dramatic change in the tactical situation. The North Korean forces that had been pressing their attack with relentless determination suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, worried about their supply lines and communications with the homeland. The 8th Army, under General Walton Walker, began to report decreased enemy pressure for the first time in months. The breakout from Pusan began on September 23rd, with American and South Korean forces launching a coordinated offensive northward. The North Korean People's Army, which had seemed invincible just weeks earlier, suddenly found itself caught in a strategic pincer movement. Units that had been advancing confidently toward their final objectives were now forced to retreat hastily, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to avoid encirclement. The link-up between the Inchon landing force and the troops advancing from Pusan occurred on September 26th, near the town of Suwon. The meeting between advance elements of the 1st Cavalry Division and the 7th Infantry Division symbolized the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred in just 11 days. The North Korean forces that had controlled most of South Korea were now trapped in a rapidly shrinking pocket, with their supply lines cut and their communications disrupted. MacArthur's strategic vision had been vindicated in the most spectacular fashion possible. The impossible landing at Inchon had not only succeeded, but had achieved results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The Korean War, which had seemed lost just weeks earlier, had been transformed by a single bold stroke of military genius. The assault on Seoul began at dawn on September 25th, with American forces attacking from multiple directions in a carefully coordinated offensive. The North Korean garrison, commanded by General Lee Kwan-moo, had spent the previous week hastily preparing defensive positions throughout the city, turning the South Korean capital into a fortress that would exact a heavy price from any attacking force. The urban warfare that followed was some of the most intense of the Korean conflict, Street fighting raged through the historic districts of Seoul, with both sides using everything from tanks to hand grenades in the bitter struggle for control of key buildings and intersections. The North Korean defenders, many of them elite troops who had been rushed north from the collapsing Pusan front, fought with desperate determination, knowing that the loss of Seoul would spell the end of their invasion. Marine Colonel Homer Litzenberg led his regiment through the narrow streets of northern Seoul, his men advancing from house to house in a deadly game of urban warfare. The North Koreans had positioned snipers and machine gun nests in buildings throughout the city, forcing the Marines to clear each structure methodically. The distinctive crack of M1 rifles and the chatter of automatic weapons echoed through the streets as the battle for the capital intensified. The civilian population of Seoul, which had endured 3 months of communist occupation, watched the fighting with a mixture of hope and terror. Many had hidden in basements and bomb shelters, waiting for the battle to pass over them. Others had fled the city entirely, joining the streams of refugees that clogged the roads leading south. The few who remained in the battle zone found themselves caught between two armies, ducking for cover as bullets flew overhead and artillery rounds exploded in the streets. The North Korean defense of Seoul was hampered by the same logistical problems that had plagued their forces throughout the peninsula. Cut off from their supply lines by the Inchon landing, the defenders were running short of ammunition and fuel. Radio communications with higher headquarters had been disrupted, leaving individual units to fight isolated battles without coordination or support. The breakthrough came on September 27th, when elements of the 1st Marine Division succeeded in capturing the crucial Han River bridges that connected northern and southern Seoul. The North Korean defenders, realizing that their position was becoming untenable, began to withdraw across the river under cover of darkness. The retreat quickly became a rout, with demoralized troops abandoning their positions and fleeing northward toward the 38th parallel. The recapture of Seoul was officially announced on September 28th, exactly 3 months after the North Korean invasion had begun. MacArthur, ever conscious of the dramatic moment, staged a formal ceremony in the South Korean Capitol building, with President Syngman Rhee and other South Korean officials in attendance. The general's speech, broadcast live to the United States, declared that the capital had been liberated by the grace of a merciful providence, and that the forces of freedom had triumphed over communist aggression. The human cost of the battle for Seoul was significant, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in the urban fighting. American forces lost nearly 1,000 killed and wounded in the assault, while North Korean casualties were estimated at several times that number. The civilian population paid the heaviest price, with thousands killed or wounded in the crossfire, and tens of thousands left homeless by the destruction. The strategic consequences of Seoul's recapture were enormous. The North Korean People's Army, which had seemed invincible just weeks earlier, had been decisively defeated and was in full retreat toward the 38th parallel. The supply lines that had sustained the communist offensive had been severed, and the morale of the North Korean forces had been shattered by the rapid reversal of their fortunes. More importantly, the recapture of Seoul restored the credibility of American military power and demonstrated that the United Nations was prepared to use force to resist communist aggression. The victory at Inchon had transformed the Korean conflict from a humiliating defeat into a dramatic triumph, setting the stage for the next phase of the war. The collapse of North Korean resistance south of the 38th parallel was swift and complete. By early October 1950, the once mighty People's Army was retreating in disorder toward the border, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape the pursuing United Nations forces. The roads leading north were littered with burned-out tanks, abandoned artillery pieces, and military vehicles that had run out of fuel during the headlong retreat. General Walker's 8th Army, now reinforced and resupplied, pressed the pursuit relentlessly. The same units that had been trapped in the Pusan perimeter just weeks earlier were now advancing rapidly northward, mopping up pockets of resistance and capturing thousands of North Korean prisoners. The psychological transformation was remarkable. Soldiers who had been fighting for survival were now confident in their ability to complete the destruction of the Communist forces. The air war over Korea had also turned decisively in favor of the United Nations. Operating from captured airfields including Kimpo, American fighter bombers ranged freely over the peninsula, attacking North Korean supply convoys and troop concentrations. The F-86 Sabres, flying from Seoul's rebuilt airfields, had established complete air superiority over the battlefield, while B-29 bombers struck targets deep in North Korean territory. The strategic situation facing Kim Il-sung's government in Pyongyang was desperate. The North Korean dictator, who had been confident of victory just weeks earlier, now faced the complete collapse of his military forces and the possible destruction of his regime. Frantic appeals for assistance had been sent to Moscow and Beijing, but neither the Soviet Union nor Communist China seemed willing to intervene directly in the conflict. MacArthur, sensing the opportunity to achieve a decisive victory, pressed his advantage ruthlessly. The general's ambitious nature, which had led him to propose the Inchon landing despite widespread skepticism, now drove him to pursue the complete destruction of North Korean military power. On October 1st, he issued an ultimatum to the North Korean government, demanding the immediate surrender of all communist forces and the acceptance of United Nations authority over the entire peninsula. The response from Pyongyang was defiant, but revealed the weakness of the North Korean position. Kim Il-sung's government rejected the ultimatum, but began evacuating personnel and equipment from the capital, preparing for a final stand in the mountainous regions near the Chinese border. The North Korean army, what remained of it, was ordered to conduct a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions in the north, where they would make a final desperate attempt to preserve the communist regime. The pursuit across the 38th parallel began on October 7th, with American and South Korean forces crossing the border in strength. The symbolic importance of this moment was not lost on anyone. For the first time in the conflict, United Nations forces were operating in North Korean territory, carrying the war to the communist homeland. The decision to cross the parallel had been controversial in Washington, but MacArthur's string of victories had given him enormous political capital and virtual carte blanche to conduct the war as he saw fit. The advance into North Korea proceeded with surprising speed. The port city of Wonsan fell on October 10th, followed by the capture of Hamhung on October 17th. North Korean resistance was sporadic and ineffective, with most units either surrendering or melting away into the countryside. The few determined defenders who attempted to make a stand were quickly overwhelmed by superior American firepower and tactics. The psychological impact of the United Nations advance was devastating. To North Korean morale, the regime's propaganda had promised inevitable victory over the imperialist aggressors, but the reality of American tanks rolling through North Korean towns and villages shattered these illusions. Thousands of North Korean soldiers deserted their units, either surrendering to advancing United Nations forces or simply returning to their homes to wait out the war. By late October, advance elements of the 8th Army had reached the outskirts of Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. The city's fall seemed imminent, and with it the complete collapse of Kim Il-sung's government. MacArthur's gamble at Inchon had paid off beyond anyone's wildest dreams, transforming a desperate defensive action into a campaign of conquest that threatened to reunify the entire Korean peninsula under non-communist rule. The first reports of Chinese involvement came from scattered patrol contacts in the rugged mountains near the Yalu River. On October 25, 1950, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division encountered what appeared to be Chinese regular army troops in the vicinity of Unsan. The initial skirmishes were brief and inconclusive, but the prisoners taken wore the distinctive uniforms of the People's Liberation Army and spoke Mandarin rather than Korean. MacArthur initially dismissed these reports as either exaggerated or involving only volunteers sent by the Chinese government to assist their North Korean allies. His intelligence officers, influenced by the general's optimistic assessment, concluded that any Chinese intervention would be limited in scope and easily contained by American firepower and air superiority. The stunning success of the Inchon operation had created a sense of invincibility that blinded the United Nations command. To the growing threat from the north, the reality was far more ominous. Marshal Peng Dehuai, commanding the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, had crossed the Yalu River with over 300,000 troops in a massive intervention that would fundamentally alter the character of the Korean conflict. The Chinese forces, veterans of the recent civil war against the nationalists, were well-trained and highly motivated, determined to prevent American forces from reaching the Chinese border. The Chinese strategy was carefully planned and brilliantly executed. Instead of announcing their presence with a massive offensive, Peng's forces infiltrated across the border in small groups, moving at night and hiding in the mountainous terrain during the day. This approach allowed them to concentrate large numbers of troops without detection by American aerial reconnaissance, setting the stage for a devastating surprise attack. The first major Chinese assault came on November 1st, when elements of the 39th Army struck the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, near Unsan. The attack came at dawn, with Chinese forces emerging from concealed positions to overrun American defensive positions with human wave tactics that overwhelmed the defenders through sheer numbers. The battalion was virtually destroyed, with hundreds of American soldiers killed or captured in the space of a few hours. The scope of the Chinese intervention became clear over the following days as additional attacks struck United Nations forces throughout the western sector of the front. The Chinese forces displayed a level of tactical sophistication and coordination that caught American commanders completely off guard. Their use of night attacks, infiltration tactics, and massed infantry assaults proved highly effective against American units that had been trained for conventional warfare. MacArthur's response to the Chinese intervention was characteristically aggressive. The general, who had been planning a final offensive to reach the Yalu River and complete the conquest of North Korea, now faced the prospect of a much larger and more dangerous conflict. His requests for additional reinforcements and expanded rules of engagement revealed the seriousness of the threat, but political considerations in Washington limited his options. The Battle of the Chongqing River, which began on November 25th, marked the full-scale entry of Chinese forces into the Korean conflict. Peng's army launched a coordinated offensive along the entire front, with over 100,000 troops attacking American and South Korean positions. The assault was preceded by a massive artillery barrage that rivaled anything seen in World War II, followed by infantry attacks that continued throughout the night. The results were catastrophic for United Nations forces. The 8th Army, which had been advancing confidently toward the Yalu River just days earlier, was forced into a precipitous retreat that quickly became a rout. Entire units were cut off and destroyed, while others abandoned their equipment and fled southward in disorder. The confident advance that had begun with the Inchon landing had been transformed into the longest retreat in American military history. The psychological impact of the Chinese intervention was enormous. The troops who had been confident of victory just weeks earlier now faced the prospect of fighting a much larger and more dangerous enemy. The success at Inchon, which had seemed to vindicate MacArthur's strategic genius, now appeared to have been the prelude to an even greater disaster. The Korean War had entered a new and more dangerous phase, one that would test American resolve and military capabilities to their limits. The winter of 1951 brought bitter cold to the Korean peninsula, and with it a sobering reassessment of the war's trajectory. The Chinese intervention had transformed MacArthur's triumph at Inchon from a decisive victory into the opening act of a much longer and more costly conflict. The United Nations forces, which had seemed on the verge of complete victory in October, now found themselves fighting desperately to maintain their positions. South of the 38th parallel, the strategic consequences of the Inchon landing, however, remained profound despite the subsequent Chinese intervention. The operation had demonstrated that American military power, when properly applied, could achieve decisive results against conventional enemies. The tactical innovations developed during the planning and execution of the landing became standard doctrine for amphibious operations, influencing military planning for decades to come. General MacArthur's reputation which had been restored by the success at Inchon, was ultimately destroyed by his handling of the Chinese intervention and his subsequent conflicts with President Truman over war policy. The general's relief from command in April 1951 marked the end of one of the most controversial military careers in American history. His farewell address to Congress, with its famous declaration that old soldiers never die, they just fade away, captured the poignancy of his fall from grace. The broader implications of the Inchon operation extended far beyond the Korean conflict itself. The landing demonstrated that surprise and audacity could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles, providing a template for future military operations. The success also validated the concept of joint operations, with Army, Navy, Marine, and Air Force units working together in unprecedented coordination. The human cost of the Korean War ultimately exceeded 50,000 American dead and over 100,000 wounded, making it one of the costliest conflicts in American history. The Chinese intervention had transformed what might have been a relatively quick victory into a 3-year war of attrition that ended in stalemate rather than decisive triumph. The armistice signed at Panmunjom in July 1953 left Korea divided much as it had been when the war began. The legacy of Inchon, however, transcended the ultimate outcome of the Korean conflict. The operation became a case study in military academies around the world, demonstrating how bold leadership and innovative tactics could overcome conventional wisdom and achieve the impossible. The principles developed during the planning and execution of the landing influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond. The port city of Inchon itself, renamed Inchon in modern South Korea, grew into one of Asia's major commercial hubs, its harbor filled with container ships rather than warships. The beaches where American Marines had landed in September 1950 became part of a thriving urban landscape, with modern apartment buildings and shopping centers replacing the mudflats and seawalls that had seemed so forbidding to the planners of Operation Chromite. The broader lesson of the Inchon landing was that military success often depends as much on psychological factors as on material superiority. MacArthur's willingness to attempt the impossible had caught the North Koreans completely off guard, demonstrating that audacity and surprise could multiply the effectiveness of military force. The operation showed that conventional military wisdom, while valuable, should not be allowed to prevent bold action when the strategic situation demanded it. The men who participated in the Inchon landing carried the memory of that September morning with them for the rest of their lives. The Marines who had waded ashore through the surf, the sailors who had navigated the treacherous channels, and the soldiers who had advanced through the streets of Seoul, all understood that they had participated in something extraordinary. The battle had lasted only days, but its impact on the course of the war and the broader Cold War struggle would be felt for decades to come. In the end, the Battle of Inchon represented both the pinnacle and the limitations of American military power. In the early Cold War era, the operation's success demonstrated that American forces could achieve remarkable victories when properly led and equipped. Its aftermath, with the Chinese intervention and the ultimate stalemate, showed that military success alone was insufficient to achieve political objectives in the complex world of post-war international relations. The tide that had turned so dramatically at Inchon would continue to ebb and flow throughout the remainder of the conflict, leaving the Korean peninsula divided and the broader questions of the Cold War unresolved.